Hey, Sherry.
Hi, Jillian.
I'm here today with Cherry Smiley, and Cherry is a radical feminist author, a writer, a speaker, a scholar. Cherry's work is focused on Indigenous women in sex work awareness, anti-violence, violence prevention and safety for women and girls, who are involved in the sex exploitation industry. And Cherry has written a book. Her book is called Not Sacred, Not Sacred, Not Squaws, Indigenous Feminism Redefined. And welcome, Sherry.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
Awesome. Um, yeah, well, I'd like to get into, like, I heard about you and we were just kind of chatting about how I heard about you. Um, when I listened to you speak, and I listened to you on Whose Body Is It podcast. What stood out right away to me was your experiences in university when you were trying to get through your PhD, and well, just your education in general, I'm sure the whole way along. Specifically focused around your work around Indigenous feminism, but when it came to um, sort of the gender critical piece and how that sort of affected you. Um, would you talk a little bit about that and your experiences there?
Yeah, for sure. It was very difficult. A PhD, I think it's not a small undertaking, but I think it gets exponentially bigger the more feminist your politics are. It just makes it that much more difficult. Um so I consider myself a gender abolitionist. I think that we should just get rid of that whole concept. I don't think it does women any favors, that's for sure. Um, so I went to Concordia University in Montreal for my PhD. And it's one of those, and it was during my time actually at Concordia that I finally, like, I wrote an article and was very clear that these are my views and just put it out into the world. And it was partly because um uh a friend of mine and an amazing activist had been deplatformed from this amazing work that she had been doing in Vancouver with uh citizens. Oh shoot, oh, that's, you can't hear that. So with citizens of Chinatown, a lot of them elderly, a lot of them who weren't English speaking. So she was this young woman doing this amazing organizing with these residents. Many of them were poor, and they managed to do this incredible thing. And then she was deplatformed because, not even necessarily because of her views, but because she was associated with um, women who were feminist and who were critical of transgender ideology, were critical of prostitution. So I was like, holy shit, that's like, it was happening. I knew other women that it had happened to. So that part wasn't new, but I just was like, wow, wow, you've deplatformed this woman, but by doing that, you've basically got rid of this group of elderly residents of Chinatown, many of whom are, have low income, many of whom are, don't speak English, and she's been doing this organizing work with them. And now you don't want to hear about any of that work simply because this woman has these associations. Um, I do have a soft spot for oldies. um, so I was just like, wow, that's that's something else. So I decided that I was going to write about it. I hope you can't hear that noise. Okay, good. Sorry.
No.
So I decided I was going to write about it. And that was it. And I did, and I kind of put it out into the world, and things just kind of snowballed from there. But it is one of those things where there was a lot of fear.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I was afraid. I already had reputation as a swerve. So I was already like considered a hate monger. You know, but had never really like publicly stated my views on gender and gender politics before. So yeah, I was definitely feeling a bit of fear. But yeah, things just kind of snowballed and like went downhill from there. And it was across the board. So I experienced bullying from the, oh gosh, I can't even remember what they're called now. Oh, the Gender Advocacy Center at Concordia at the time. Experienced bullying kind of from the center as a whole, from individuals in that center. And that, you know, I tried to deal with that. Went to the Office of Rights and Responsibilities. Nothing ever happened. I didn't feel like I could participate in that I could use the services of my university. So we did talk about earlier a sexual assault that I had experienced, and I was like, I can't go to the sexual assault center on campus for a few reasons. One reason being it's not woman only, so I was worried about, you know, sitting in the waiting room with a man, but also because that center was so closely linked to the Center for Gender Advocacy, and there was a lot of cross volunteers. And I was like, I don't think I'm going to get treated with respect. I don't think I'm not going to get treated like other students get treated simply because of my politics. And I mean, and that was not with that situation, but that got confirmed later on when I had individuals tell me to my face that they're not going to support me after an incident of sexual harassment because of my politics on gender. So they're basically saying, you know, Indigenous women who are critical of transgender politics deserve to be sexually harassed and deserve to be, you know, sexually assaulted. So that was to actually hear that come out of the mouths of other individual people was, I was like, wow, that's bold. That's bold. And so yeah, so it just, you know, things just kind of got worse and worse. I was on campus less and less. I was worried about, you know, there had been talk about, you know, individuals confronting me and this kind of thing, and you know, I didn't want to deal with that. And so I really was pushed out in a lot of ways by, you know, the Center for Gender Advocacy, by other students, by employees of Concordia, professors there, you know, really, you know, well known, well respected professors, you know, were participating in this kind of campaign against me. And it was yeah, I guess it was to be expected. I mean, you know, it's not going to be easy, but on the other hand, it shouldn't be that hard. You know, it shouldn't be that hard. And you would think that at the very basic level, you would think that regardless of whatever your politics are, you would think that everybody would agree on the fact that Indigenous women, or that women in general, never deserve to be sexually harassed or sexually assaulted. You would think that's a kind of a basic understanding. You would hope kind of among, you know, progressive or progressive identifying individuals, but that's not the case.
Well, and in fact, that's what the whole missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry is surrounding. It's surrounding actually just investigating into the aspects of society and culture as to why this is happening. And you have appropriately retermed missing and murdered as murdered and disappeared. You do that, as I understand. Well, actually, you know what? Why don't you explain why you do that? Why do you say disappeared rather than missing?
I say that because what it does is it acknowledges the perpetrator. It acknowledges that there's another party involved in this who is actually doing the disappearing. So women aren't just vanishing into thin air or, you know, anything like that. They're actively being, you know, kidnapped or murdered or, you know, trafficked, whatever. And so it acknowledges that there's a perpetrator, kind of in the similar way. You know, I'll say women in prostitution or prostituted women. It's a similar kind of thing where it recognizes that there's another party involved, that, you know, needs to be held to account.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the work that you do, I mean, it intersects, obviously, like it's almost like it was a natural sort of connection between sort of the gender critical aspect and the prostitution sex work critical aspect, because what you're doing is you're locating sex-based discrimination and what women and girls face, especially Indigenous women and girls face, as different than other people in society face. Sexual minorities, people like, especially 2S LGBTQ QIA plus people, often are men and or male-bodied people, right? And those people experience violence, discrimination, harassment, and assaults, murders, all forms of marginalization, stigmatization, and oppression for different reasons, and for different statistical realities than women do.
Yes.
Women and girls do. So that's where you've become critical, and well, not only, but that's a major aspect of your work, where you're trying to delineate, look, like there are different reasons for these experiences in different groups. And I guess my interpretation of it is that it's inherently depoliticizing to say, well, we're just going to like lump these groups together, and then we're going to talk about the discrimination that these people face. And you're basically saying, no, women and girls face different kinds of discrimination, different kinds of assault, different kinds of victimization than these other groups, and we need to keep them separate. And from that basis, you are attacked and basically, you know, deplatformed, shunned, exiled socially. Like these things happen, and harassed and bullied on campus and online, for saying, no, Indigenous women and girls face different kinds of victimization than other people in gendered-based categories. And on top of that, as you said, I'd like to get rid of gender completely, and we need to focus on sex, because that's where the difference is in yeah. And so yeah, so that's what I've been reading in your work, and I just find it so difficult to wrap my head around how people can look at your work, look at how important your work is for like violence and victimization awareness. You know, violence against women and girls bad, you know, except when it comes to the sex industry, except when it comes to prostitution, except when it comes to sex work, except when it comes to porn. You know, those are all good for women. Even though they include violence and victimization, and that's like the literal, like that's the foundation of often these practices. Yeah, wow. And like it's just so stunning to hear that this happened, because the work that you're doing is centering Indigenous women in a time where we're supposed to be centering Indigenous women in this whole inquiry, and you do a whole sort of analysis of that in your book, which is, that in itself is worth reading the book because it's so important.
Oh, thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, no, of course.
Um, I think that we definitely, I mean, with the inquiry, with all the discussion about male violence, you know, against Indigenous women and girls, it became violence, people perpetrating violence against other people. So it did get really depoliticized, and you're so right that the histories of male violence that Indigenous women and girls have experienced, how it happens, why it happens, you know, all of those reasons are much more similar to other women, generally to non-Indigenous women, right? So I think about male violence against Indigenous women is happening, it's in particular ways. So it's not different to other women, but it happens in particular ways for particular reasons. So in that whole inquiry, there wasn't any feminist analysis of male violence against women, feminist analysis of, you know, male violence in the home, feminist analysis of incest, you know, all of these, you know, prostitution, all of this work that women have done for decades and longer, to come up with this analysis of, you know, why, for example, a husband might murder his wife, you know, and feel like he's entitled to do that. You know, we didn't talk about any of that. It was like it didn't even exist, right? And so we missed out on an actual feminist analysis of this issue that is inherently, I think, one that feminists should care about and do care about, you know. And then it was a 2S LGBTQIA plus, you know, that got included kind of halfway through, or just all of a sudden it was pressure from groups essentially. I mean, and when you hear that 2SLGBTQIA plus, essentially we're talking about transgender advocacy groups, right? So trans rights groups. Generally we're talking about men who identify as women, maybe men who identify as non-binary, or women who identify as non-binary, but primarily in a lot of cases we're talking about men who are identifying as women. And it's so true that that violence, that it does happen for sure, and that needs to be addressed, but it is not the same as male violence against women when we're thinking about women as a sex-based class of human beings. And what's really important about that too is that the solutions are different, right? So what we need to do to try and address that problem, it's going to be different. There's unique challenges. So just as an example, if a man, for example, is sexually assaulted, one of his fears might be that people will think that he's gay, you know, if he comes and he, you know, he reveals this awful thing that has been done to him by another man. Women generally will fear that nobody will believe them, right? So it's a totally, you're dealing with totally different barriers, you're dealing with totally different contexts, and you need to address the issue differently. So it doesn't do anybody any good, especially women and girls, when you're kind of lumping us all together and excluding a feminist analysis of male violence on an inquiry about male violence.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and I mean, like, yep. There's different support system factors, there's different statistical factors, there's different all sorts of things, and these things do get skewed when we erase the sort of definitions of sex within research, inquiry, and methodology. Yeah, there was a quote that was relating to this that I thought was kind of appropriate. It was from Louise Armstrong when she was doing her work around ending incest in the family. And I wanted to kind of link it to the idea of the missing and murdered women and girls inquiry, because what she says is that people say to me, well, but at least we're talking about it now. And she says, yes, but it was not our intention merely to start a long conversation. In breaking this silence, we hope to raise hell. Instead, we have raised for the issue a certain normalcy. So it's like we're talking about it now, but without those other factors and that action behind those other factors, i.e. feminist analysis and feminist groups as a integral part of the inquiry, research and decision-making processes, what is actually happening, because we're not even identifying certain problems without having those factors involved.
And it's like, I mean, there's a couple issues at play too, I think, with murdered and disappeared Indigenous women. It's like we get stuck in the mourning, we get stuck in the grief. And then it's like the solution becomes healing, and that's part of it, healing, but there's way more. There's so much more beyond kind of individual or even like community healing from the grief that needs to happen. Like we need to stop men from raping women and men from murdering women at the beginning, so that we don't have to then deal with the grief afterwards. You know what I mean? So it's like we get stuck in that, and the media loves that, right? They love to see Indigenous women bawling their eyes out and doing kind of cultural activities or whatever, using kind of symbols that are very identifiable to non-Indigenous people. They love that, right? They eat it up. They love to show that kind of that spectacle, right? So it becomes very hard. And I mean, when you're kind of stuck in this grief and this mourning, it isn't, yes, it's a process, and yes, we need to go through it, and we do need some healing, but it's the analysis, the political analysis is what gets you out of that, right? Otherwise you just get stuck in there and like there's no way out, because you don't know, you can't find a way out. It's kind of like when the Montreal, I think similar to when the Montreal massacre happened. I was too young for that, but I was too young when that happened. But I think that I understand that their kind of slogan became first mourn, then organize, right? So it was like, yes, we need to do these things, and we need to have these these vigils and these kinds of things, but there's so much more that needs to happen. And I really do feel like with murdered and disappeared Indigenous women, we just get stuck. We get stuck in the grief, and everybody wants, that's where they want to keep us, is in the grief, and in in the healing, whatever that means, so that it just becomes a lot more difficult to speak about the perpetrators who are primarily men, and what are we going to do about this issue that we've identified.
Yeah, absolutely. It takes all the sort of politicization components out of it, and focuses on just like, which as you've stated, like, are very important components, like mourning and healing and supporting each other are very important aspects of progress. But I think there's a lot of, when you remove people's ability to speak about certain issues, that's what you're doing, right? And I'm wondering too, about, within all of your experiences, it's like on sort of a macro level, what happens when we as a culture, society, community, when we silence the very voices of the people like that we're supposed to be platforming and upholding within these issues? Like, you speak about things that aren't necessarily politically correct within the sort of wider zeitgeist right now. you challenge the notions of like combining, the 2S LGBTQ plus within, for instance, the MMWIG inquiry, as well as the sex work, advocacy, and awareness work that you do. What happens when I guess what I'm asking is, what happens when we silence Indigenous women? Yeah, when we don't agree with them.
Well, we end up staying exactly where we are, and like Louise Armstrong stated, we stay exactly where we are, but we get this industry built up around all of this stuff, the healing, the kind of the superficial talk about the people committing violence against other people, all this kind of stuff. We really don't get beyond that. And the thing is that for most women, I would say most women aren't feminist, and there's a lot of really valid reasons why that is, but it also is so important to perpetuating patriarchy, right? Like that's what the system needs, is most women not to be feminist in order to keep going, right? So it's so important for women to be able to group together and talk about these issues and raise our consciousness together and come up with political theories together, recognize our similarities and our differences, together, and build this kind of political analysis of what the heck is going on, why is it going on, and what can we do about it. That's actually that's what gets us out, right? But if you have these spaces that are considered sacred, they're untouchable, you can't speak about them. I don't know how many times I've been accused of being disrespectful to families or being disrespectful to communities or whatever, so kind of using that idea of the sacred as a way to shut women down, and tell them that they can't say these things, in these places, when it's like glaringly obvious that this is what we're talking about, but we're not actually allowed to say it. I mean, it's crazy making, right? Like it can feel very confusing.
Yep.
And the issue is straightforward in a lot of ways, and it's more complicated in other ways. And like for women to be able to come together and we kind of hash it out ourselves, that's when we get to kind of the more complicated bits, I think. Otherwise it just makes it more confusing for women, and then you don't know who to listen to. You don't know, are you allowed to say this in this space? Is somebody gonna come and tell you that you've done something wrong, and the world's gonna end? Well, I mean, they don't say that, but this idea that if you offend somebody, like that's it, you're done, you've committed the worst crime in the history of the universe, and you should be tarred and feathered for that. So that, and I think with non-Indigenous women, there's often hesitation sometimes, and it comes from a lot of different things, wanting to do things in a good way, right? Wanting to to say use the right terminology, and and all these kinds of things, and follow cultural protocols. And I don't even follow cultural protocols when I think that they're discriminatory towards women or based in sexism. But so there's this desire to to want to do that, and then you kind of dump this all this other stuff, with the sacredness and the you can say this and you can't say that. I think a lot of women get stuck, non-Indigenous and Indigenous women. You kind of freeze because you're not really sure how to get out of this, because there's no clear path, right? And so I think partly it's why it's so important, I think, that women generally, so Indigenous women and non-Indigenous women, have places to talk amongst ourselves, to be honest with each other about the things that we have experienced in our lives, so that we can begin to form these theories, similar to in the 60s and 70s, consciousness raising groups that happened among women at the time. We've it's still around. It's never gone away, but it's like we need it now more than ever, almost. And it's harder now more than ever to do that because there is such a push against space that's just for women, right? This idea of inclusivity is like number one. Everybody should be included in everything all the time.
Yeah.
When that's not going to get you anywhere.
No, boundaries are inherently exclusive, right? Yeah, and creating boundaries is inherently exclusive act. I want to segue on that note. I definitely can speak to feeling like I don't want to say the wrong thing, or I don't want to challenge any sort of traditional or cultural statements or beliefs that are widely imposed. Almost like a lot of it, like of course, so much of what we're taught is very pan-Indigenous. It's a pan-Indigenous application. Like it's like, this is what Indigenous people believe. It's like, well, which Indigenous people and what yeah, like which Indigenous people, what communities believe that, what cultures believed this, but which is why I find one of the reasons I find your book so fascinating, because it seeks to locate colonization as primarily a sex-based practice first, and perhaps a race-based practice second, but that patriarchy was not so much forced, but adopted by Indigenous men and forced upon Indigenous women. And that's kind of the first time I've heard it framed like that, Cherry, and like that really intrigued me. Not, because it's devastating, but it's also like, wow, right. It does frame our experiences as much more similar than different. And I think that, like, in terms of being women and experiencing victimization by men. And so I really, I really thought that was really interesting.
And it took me a long time to get there. I mean, for many, many years, I was like, patriarchy was imposed, that's what I'd heard. But the entire time there's this like niggling feeling, right, where I'm like, but this doesn't explain the male violence that happens within Indigenous families and Indigenous communities. So that doesn't quite fit. So it was actually so I was doing my PhD and I started out with this, very kind of widely accepted definition of colonization, looking at it as, in terms of race and kind of nation building, and taking away of lands and these kinds of things, right? And then I remember I was like, what? Wait a minute. It was after reading something by Robin Morgan, who I cannot say how much I love Robin Morgan. And I was like, wait a minute, all of these theories of colonization have been developed by men. Like, and we didn't really realize that, right? Because men are kind of the standard, right? So what if women developed a theory of colonization that was actually women-centered, as opposed to a male-defined kind of man-centered theory? And it's not always done on purpose, right? It can be often it's a very subconscious thing, that we're not considering, the differences between, female people and male people, and the social, structures around that, and how those have been built up and developed, and, how we are where we are now, right? And so it took a while, but that was really what started it. I was like, wait a minute. Who said this? you know, and when it was kind of, I started questioning that I was like, oh, okay, I see here. And then went back and, you know, looked at other feminists, you know, like, again, like Robin Morgan, like Gerda Lerner, these women who had begun to develop these ideas of colonization as a sex-based process. And so, you know, looked at those ideas and just kind of developed them further, and to really look at that process in Canada. And you know what? People get so mad when I say that. They really do. And, you know, it's more often non-Indigenous people, not always.
Mhm.
But, you know, I know, you know, in doing the work that I was doing, um, you know, Indigenous women will come up and be like, yeah, no, that's happened to me too. Yeah, you know, that happened in my community, or that happened in my, you know, they get it because they live it, right?
Mhm.
They understand
Mhm.
the levels of it. You know, and they you know, so it is and I've had in my kind of career, I guess, as a scholar at Concordia, um, had a number of non-Indigenous academics like tell me directly to my face, you cannot say that. Like, you can't talk about male violence from Indigenous men against Indigenous women, you know. And um so, you know, I think when somebody tells you not to do something, that's usually the time that you should do it.
Yeah, that's why I love your work. Because you didn't stop. You didn't stop when they told you to stop. It's so complex trying to like explain how taking a feminist perspective on female women's issues in any context is important, because I think it's, especially when we're sort of mired in the language of academia, and you know, you say like women from your community or women from other communities will come to you and go, oh yeah, like this is sort of like, this is kind of like a universal thing, like we experience this, or we experience this, and it is the patriarchy, that's what it is.
Mm-hmm.
It's patriarchal imposition, but it's so, people just want to make it like black and white. People want to make it like, here's Indigenous issues, and then here's other issues. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's really weird. Yeah, I don't know if I articulated that quite properly, but it is a very, like, it's really hard to explain to people why feminist analysis is important. Because
To
even,
women, right?
right, but that's the thing, is like, even with like certain initiatives that are like, you know, rolling out right now, it's like the feminist analysis instantly was gone. It was like gone. It was like, nope, sex work is good for women, and we're not even going to talk about that. So right off the
Mm-hmm.
hop, there's like your feminine. Well, I mean, your rad femme critique is gone. I mean, you still got. I'm probably going to muck this up, but what is it, like? You still got like third wave feminism, or you know, saying, is it third wave? I don't know. I'm really,
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, you could say it's liberal
yes,
feminism,
liberal
third
feminism.
wave feminism, but I think a lot of women like Sheila Jeffreys and other women, and I would agree with this, that the third wave feminism is actually it's not feminist, it's actually a backlash to
Yeah,
feminism. Like, it's
that's it.
trying to undo
Yeah,
trying to undo feminism
yeah,
and our theory, and, you know, gains that we've made.
yeah.
Yeah.
I would like to switch over to some of your advocacy around sex work and prostitution, some of your work there. Um, in your Globe and Mail article, which is an amazing article, everyone should take a look at that. You refer to the Nordic model as sort of a more optimal, or at least sort of looking towards a more optimal approach to addressing the issues that women face in prostitution and sex exploitation. Would you talk about that a little bit and what you mean, like what's the Nordic model and what, yeah, and I'd also, if you want to like go into this as well, I'm curious on your thoughts about criminalization and how, if you think that's at all applicable or who that's applicable to. Yeah.
So the Nordic model it's like a policy or legislation that looks at prostitution, and it came about in Sweden. I think it was 1999. I have to check on that. Many years ago, anyways. And before that, prostitution had actually been legal in Sweden, so it was quite the turnaround. And so the Nordic model has three main components. One being that buyers of prostitution, so the men, overwhelmingly men who are the Johns, and overwhelmingly men who are the pimps who are selling other women, are criminalized for that action, and that individuals who are selling sex acts in prostitution, who are overwhelmingly women and girls, are totally decriminalized. So they don't face any kind of criminal sanction. That's one component. I think the model often gets reduced to just that, but that's one part of it. And you need all three parts of it for it to really work well. The second part of it would be a public education campaign. So, and that, that would be very rigorous and widespread, because we're told all these lies, about prostitution and the happy hooker, and like women love it. Women love like sucking dicks of men whose dicks they don't want to suck, but they love it. All of these ridiculous things that we're taught.
Yep.
About women, and men, that men need this somehow. So a public education campaign that really unpacks all the lies that we have been taught. And the third major part of it is really robust social services. So access to housing, access to, detox and recovery, enough, money coming in, whether that's guaranteed livable income or some other model, of making sure that you're not living in poverty, when for whatever reason you aren't able to work. Making sure that women have access to counseling, they have access to women's political groups, I think, which is not something I think that was explicitly stated in the Nordic model, but I think is something that is really important and becoming more important, that we need to make sure that we have that ability to do that, to organize in groups that we identify, where we decide who is a part of this group and who isn't. So it's those three parts that you need. And so in Canada, we have an incomplete version of the Nordic model, but it's definitely a step. It's in the right direction. I mean, I'd rather we have this than what we had before. So mostly in Canada, it's a criminal offense to purchase sex acts from anybody and to pimp women out, which is great. There are very few circumstances where, and generally I just say women in prostitution because it's overwhelmingly women in prostitution. Of course, these laws apply to everybody, women and men who are in prostitution, and of course nobody, women or men, should have to should be in that situation and have that type of male violence done to them. So there are certain situations where women are criminalized. I think if you're like selling sex acts like near a school or a daycare, and then if you're impeding the flow of traffic, I think is another case. So it's not a full decriminalization, but it's pretty close. But we're so lacking on the social services. We're so lacking on the public education, right? Where you have police forces like the Vancouver Police Department, when the legislation came out, they released like a YouTube video basically saying this is their lowest priority and they're not going to be arresting men who buy sex acts because they don't think that they're doing anything wrong, right? So yeah, so where there's better or I think more resources that can be put into that, but where it's definitely we're in a much better situation than we were. And I think with criminalization, because I mean, when I think about prostitution, it's like, so you kind of have the total decriminalization, which is often New Zealand is presented as like this mecca of like sex work. And it's never totally decriminalized. There's always there'll be bylaws, city bylaws, or kind of provincial or whatever county, whatever laws that kind of regulate where it can happen, these kinds of things, right? So there always is a little bit of regulation. Then you have like the fully legalized model, which in the Netherlands, and that's switching around. They realized they made a huge mistake there. It's in Germany as well, for example. Are the other kind of ways of those, neither of those ways are trying to end prostitution, right? They're just trying to manage where it happens and who it happens to. And I think with criminalization, I think it's so important. There needs to be consequences. And criminalization doesn't necessarily mean like throwing men into jail, for 20 years. There's different ways that criminalization can happen. And in Sweden, there is different ways that it happens. It can happen with a fine. It can happen with, I don't know, they impound your car. Like, it doesn't necessarily mean jail. And I think when we talk about that, people that be like, they're carceral feminists, like we love jail or something like that, or like we love prison. And I mean, I'm definitely a prison abolitionist for women. I don't think that women should be in prison. We can have other discussions about men. I can't fully get behind the idea of prison abolition for men at this point, but yeah, so this idea that there's consequences to your actions, it is a deterrent for men. They don't want to get caught. They don't want their wives or their family members to find out what they're doing, because they know that it's harmful and they choose to do it anyways. So this kind of criminalization, I think this model where it's that asymmetrical criminalization, I think that's a much better approach than to fully decriminalize it or fully legalize it. Because when you fully decriminalize it or you fully legalize it, you're leaving it up to the free market, right? You're leaving it up to capitalism to like regulate itself. And we all know that's doesn't happen. And that never happens. We saw in Germany, like brothels were trying to undercut each other, right? So they would offer more extreme acts for like less and less money because they're trying to, compete with all of these other brothels, like just disgusting stuff. And so we've seen, we see what happens, right? And so I'm like, no, don't want to leave this up to the free market, which is essentially men, trying to make money, as much money as they possibly can with zero worry or concern about impacts on women, impacts on the planet, impacts on girls. They just feel entitled, and they take it.
Yeah, men making money and also men being able to victimize and use women and girls for their pleasure. Just to add on to the robust social services aspect, and when you're talking about we're so not there yet. Yeah, I wanted to just add that even in higher education in Canada, we're being taught that that sex work is good for women, that porn is good for women, all the benefits, all the you know, that women are happy doing sex work, that, you know, even though there's so much evidence and research to the contrary, even though we know, and like, as you pointed out in your book, oftentimes the statistics get so skewed because we're not counting underage minors as doing sex work. So it's like, that's like in a whole other category. So, you know, and vice versa. Like sometimes we'll put, like, it's just the statistics seem, you know, this isn't a conspiracy theory, but the statistics always seem to be sort of skewed in favor of whatever, as, you know, as statistics go, in favor of whatever the sort of goal is to show.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, they tell part of a story, right? Statistics
mhm,
tell a little part of a story, but they're also telling, it depends on who you ask
yeah,
and what questions you're asking
yeah,
and when you're asking them. Like all of these things are so important. And it's also, I think, because so much of the research there's so much pro-sex work research. It's like there's mountains and mountains and mountains of it. They have a lot of money, they have a lot of backing, they have a lot of support, because it's kind of the, you know, it's the popular thing to be like, yeah, sex work is work. um you know, and but it's mostly coming from a public health perspective, right, which is very, very narrow.
mhm,
So they have very narrow questions and they're only looking for an answer to this question,
mhm,
right? And so there's all this other information I'm sure that individuals are sharing,
yeah,
as well, but it doesn't matter. So they don't want the full story, so they don't take that in, and then they don't present the full story to those who are, um reading the research, or looking at the research afterwards. So
yeah,
um it's and it's one of those things. It was Maria Mies, who just passed away not that long ago, and I was like, oh man, because I wanted to get a hold of her and tell her, how much she changed my life, um with her incredible writing. And I kind of regret not doing that, or trying to do that anyways. But she said, when she did this research project with women, and it had to do with male violence in the home, um and she said the truth, something like the truth develops over time,
mhm,
um which is also very true. So when you're in it versus you've been out of it maybe for 10 years,
yep,
or your ideas, maybe what you thought was fine when you're 15, and now you're 45 and you're like, I can see how that has impacted me.
yep,
um
yep,
is
absolutely.
such an important part of the conversation too, right?
Yeah. Well, and yeah, yes, absolutely. And yeah, and certain, like when you're out of, not even just different ages, but when you're out of a certain mindset, when you're in a different mindset or you're in a different stage of life,
Yeah.
it's like a world of difference. You're literally a different person. And I
Mhm.
think like what people feel to remember when they're like, this was my always my biggest struggle when talking about this stuff, is that like this is harming women and girls. This is not like, this is like, yes, there absolutely might be women, and absolutely are women. Sorry, I'm not even going to deny that there are women out there who choose this and would choose it over anything else, and this is their favorite line of work and it's what they want to do. Sure, let's just say that that exists. I'm going to agree with that for the sake of the argument. The vast majority of women and girls are not engaged in this for personal excellence or pleasure or whatever.
Hmm.
It's out of desperation. It's often out of fear, often out of addiction, often out. There's so many
Yeah.
social variables that come into play that are like, that are forcing women to make decisions that they don't otherwise want to make or wouldn't otherwise make. Like I
Hmm.
just, that always stops me dead in my tracks in these conversations, is that, yeah, when you talked about like, you know, we're just we're just sort of like prison happy, like we want to send everybody to prison and just make everybody, you know, pay for their crimes in the sort of the colonial prison system. It's like, no, but yeah, you're right. There do have to be consequences for men. They're abusing women. That's what this is. This is
Mm.
exploitation, assault, violence,
Mhm.
and often murder.
Mhm. And this, like, I mean, this happy hooker idea, like this idea, it's such a lie, right? And they hold on to that. Well, I have a friend, and she likes it. And it's like, no, she doesn't. Like, no, she doesn't.
Yeah, and
She might
oftentimes,
like, she might like having sex.
yeah,
Sure, that's great. Knock yourself out. But when you're in prostitution, you don't get to have the type of sex that you want to have with the individuals you want to be having it with
no,
in that at that particular moment, right? So that those are, it's a very, one is, pleasurable, enjoyable, you actually get to choose. The other is, an obligation of your job.
yeah,
It's not about you, it's all about him.
mhm,
um and you don't want to be there. I mean, when we think outside of prostitution, we think that when a woman engages in unwanted sex acts with a man, we would call that sexual assault, and we would say that's harmful for her. Hopefully we would say that. Most women would say that, yes,
yeah,
this is harmful
yeah,
for her, that she's had to do this. But all of a sudden, when it's in prostitution, when women are doing this over and over and over, how many times a day, engaging in unwanted sex acts with men they don't want to be having sex with, that's going to do damage to you. And, you know, you can say, women can say they love it all they want, and that's fine. Um, that's an opinion, that's a perspective, but it's bigger than that,
yeah,
right? It's bigger than one woman
mhm,
saying, well, I like it, therefore it's good.
yeah,
um Rapists like raping women, but we don't say, well, that guy likes it, so therefore it's good, right? So there's a larger context there,
yeah,
uh, that needs to be looked at. And it's kind of the partially the difference too between, and I've made this point over the years, that there's the experience of it, so you're going to have your feelings and your thoughts and of your experience, but
mhm,
then there's the analysis of the experience, right? So, if a woman is saying that that's her experience and she just loves it and it's great, that's her experience. But my analysis of that experience tells me something different,
mhm.
right? And so that's where we can disagree.
And you hit bang on like the cultural, sort of the larger cultural implications of women enjoying being, necessarily violated or exploited, selling them their sex for money, is like there isn't, it doesn't exist in a vacuum, and it was created by a system and a structure that profits and sort of where pleasure is associated with the harming of women and girls. So there's a whole, yeah, there's a whole, I mean, it's like 1,000 PhDs, right? It's not something that's simple, but I think that it's so often simplified in such a disturbing context. And yeah, yeah. Um, you've experienced, I mean, that's like a huge part of it, is that you've experienced so much vitriol and backlash for your critical positions on the sex work industry, online, in physical reality, like your platform, if you want to say like deplatform or whatever, censoring, um and what I find interesting and so applicable is that you sort of highlight that these are agendas at play. Like, so there's a patriarchal agenda at play that silences women who are dissenting this, um and like it's inherently, yeah, anti-feminist and anti-woman to be like, to silence women who are sex industry critical. Like it's not, um it's a game, and then
Yeah.
and they win the game when they like succeed in sort of doing that, right?
Just
Yeah.
shutting down any discussion or debate, because
Mhm.
there is discussion and there is debate
Mhm.
on prostitution, on the idea of gender, and like, is that real, isn't it? All of these kinds of things, they are up
Yep.
for debate.
Yep.
Right? Like, we need to debate them. I mean, that's how we end up, I think, with better policies, with better solutions,
100%.
when we're going back and forth, and we're trying to figure things out.
Yep. I want to bring up a quote here from your book. On page 48, it says, a more critical investigation into these issues and controversies surrounding prostitution would only have benefited the process and outcomes of the inquiry, relating to the missing and murdered inquiry of Indigenous women and girls. Both of these issues, gender and prostitution, are controversial and often difficult to speak about. But issues being controversial and difficult to speak about is not a reason to stay silent or to quickly adopt a more popular, non-critical position in order to protect oneself or ease the process. But this is what's happening. And this is what women are being encouraged to, coerced, sort of scared into doing. And I mean, you described a little bit of that. Why do you think it's so important to and why do you think it's important, and how do you deal with the sort of backlash that you get?
I mean, sometimes it gets me down, some days more than others, but I mean, I'm sure we've all contemplated the meaning of life. Why are we here? The meaning of the universe. And so I've decided that my answer to that question is that the meaning of life is fun. So that's kind of how I try and live my life. And the issues that I talk about, and the issues that I'm working on and working, with women who've been through just the most horrific things you could ever imagine. And some of those women are my own family members. It's not easy. It's not easy, so I do try and find fun where I can. And I think that one of I many years ago, I helped to run this group for Indigenous girls in Vancouver. And one of the things that we talked about a lot was our ability to laugh and to joke around, despite sometimes these horrible conditions, that we find ourselves in. You get a group of Native women together, and you're gonna hear you're gonna hear some laughter, right? And so so sometimes I try to, the backlash, I try to not take it too seriously. I'm like, haters gonna hate, what can you do? You can't please everybody. And for me, I want to be able, when I go to sleep at night, I want to be like, okay, like I did everything that I could today, to do things in a good way. I did what I thought was right, and I stuck to that. Like I didn't give up on that. I didn't let somebody stomp on that. I didn't change my mind because of this pressure, but I did what I thought was right. So I can feel good about that, kind of regardless of the outcome. You know what I mean? I think it's, in that sense, it's a lot easier. I mean, I think when you have these critical ideas, these feminist ideas, and you're hiding them from the world, that's a whole other world of pain. The anxiety, somebody's going to find out what you actually think. You're going to be outed. And you're going to lose this, and you're going to lose that. And it does happen sometimes. Women do lose jobs, they lose friends, they lose things, but they gain so much more in return, right? And so, kind of between keeping quiet and trying to hide, and then just saying what I want to say. I'm just gonna say what I want to say. And so it's just trying to approach these, really trying to have keep my heart light, as light as I can.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. So many things, it's just never ends. I have so many questions. Netherlands. So you mentioned the Netherlands earlier, and I wanted to, so oftentimes the Netherlands is used as a sort of a gleaming, glowing example of how well sex work works and how just successful it is. So and you kind of mentioned something earlier about how they were kind of turning their policies around a little bit. Could you go into that? I haven't heard of that.
Yeah, okay.
Mhm.
So I remember it was a couple of years ago. It was, I believe it was coming from the mayor of the city of Amsterdam. And what they were doing was they were closing down a number of the windows where, you know, in the red light district where prostitution happens, because they were realizing how harmful it was for women. They were you know, and how you know, to put women on display like that,
Mhm.
you know, is I've been there. It's this it's terrifying, actually, is the I would describe. I was there with a friend of mine, and we went on I think we were there on a Friday night or a Saturday night, and it was terrifying. There was men everywhere, everywhere. And then you would hear men in like groups like chanting or like singing songs, and you could hear that, but you didn't know like what direction they're coming in. My friend was like assaulted. A man, you know, grabbed her. She pushed him, I pushed him, and then he's like threatening to kill us and throw us in the canal and have like screaming at us. And all around in a circle, it's all men watching this happen, you know. And I had men, um, you know, uh, pimps. You saw the pimps on the street watching the women, you know, so making sure that they took every guy that went to their door or whatever. And, you know, seeing that very obviously a good portion of those women were very, very, very young women, and were definitely under the influence of drugs or alcohol, which, I mean,
Yeah.
it's a coping mechanism, right?
Yeah.
You know, so there's no judgment there. But to see it and experience it,
Mhm.
you know, and then to walk there during the day where you have families walking through,
Yeah.
like it's a tourist attraction. Like, so yeah, so they've definitely so they closed a huge number of windows. I'm not really sure. I'd have to look up what kind of has happened since then. But I do remember when I was there, they had an area, it was called the Black Corner, and that's where all the Black women and women of color were. So it was not on the main area. It was kind of off to the side. You had to go down a bit of a different street, but that's where you would find the women of color, Black women, where you could have more extreme sex acts for less amounts of money. So yeah, so as far as I know, they still have the same like legislation in place when it comes to prostitution. But yeah, I'd have to look up to see what's kind of happened since then. But it was definitely a shift, I think, in city politics, just realizing that it wasn't working.
It's disturbing, doesn't even describe. That's wow. I feel like I want to say I'm sorry that you had to see that, but yeah, it's also important to like know that that exists, I guess. Like, oh, yeah,
It was like, yeah, I won't forget that.
yeah,
It was very scary. It was very scary because it's just men everywhere, and none of these men have good intentions, right? Like,
yeah,
none of these men see women as fully human and worthy of respect, and, you know,
yeah,
worthy to, you know, have boundaries, you know, like, yeah. It
yeah.
was just so, and they're like, there's lots of drinking, of course, and all, but it was like
And
teeming with
yeah,
men.
and like gangs of men, like gangs of
Yeah,
men running
like
the street.
roving around singing their drunken songs or whatever, and they're chanting, and you're just like, oh my God, this is really scary. This is really scary.
Yeah,
We're not safe. We're not welcome here, and we're not safe here.
yeah. And for all the haters who want to say, you know, we hate women or we hate sex workers or whatever, I will just say, like, I don't actually judge individual women for their choices. Like, I think that there's a myriad of choices that lead someone into making those decisions, and or even being in a situation where it's not a decision. So I do blame the structure that exists and the men who exploit women, and the system that allows that to happen. But yeah, it's not the women that
Yeah.
I'm challenging or criticizing. It's the system that was built so that this could happen.
System. It's a system, and it's the men, and
Mhm.
it's the patriarchy. Is like, I'm not going to judge her. Of course not.
Yeah.
I think most women have had a point in their lives where they've considered
Yeah.
doing some type of prostitution or stripping or something like that. You know, you need money. You know, so that's common. That's common. It's
Yeah.
very common. You
Yeah.
know, so there's no judgment there at all. You know, you're making the best choice out of usually a bunch of shitty options that you have to choose from, so you make the best choice that you can. So there's no, you know, women shouldn't feel any shame, or, you know, and they do, and that shame, it kills women.
Yeah.
You know, and it stops women from speaking. So there's a woman that I spoke with, Tanis, made this really great point, because she's like, there's so many women out there who've been in prostitution. They're never going to talk to a researcher.
Yeah.
They're never going to tell another living, breathing human being what happened to them. And they might do that because they're embarrassed and they feel shamed. They might do it because they're just trying to forget what happened and just move on with their lives. But so you're going to have all of these women that are never, you know, you're not going to hear from them, because that shame is so all consuming. And then all the women who've been killed in that process, right? Actually, like, killed by Johns, killed by men who buy sex, or killed by pimps, or killed by, you know, drugs, or killed by, you know, at their own hand, you know, because they can't deal with what was done to them. Like, you know, so there's so many women that we'll never hear from. You know, and it's like, what about those women? You know, those women weren't having a good time. You know, and yeah, there's no shame in that, but there should be shame. Men should feel ashamed of their shitty ass behavior.
Yeah.
And I am going to judge their behavior,
Yeah.
and they should stop it.
Yeah.
It's terrible.
Yeah. In your book, you talk about some of the work that you did in New Zealand, and I'm curious, because I actually haven't gotten to that part of the book yet. I'm curious what, if any, I'm sure many, but similarities and differences there are between, like, let's say somewhere like in New Zealand and somewhere like Canada, and you have experience in both places with regards to violence against sex work, and yeah, and involving women and girls, particularly Indigenous women and girls.
Right. So I mean, in both places, in Australia too, you have a disproportionate amount of Indigenous women and girls who are in prostitution. And very often, even in New Zealand, Indigenous women are very often on the street. So they're the most visible, women who are, you know, standing out there on the street. But, you know, there's the women, and I've met many women too who have been indoors, you know, in brothels indoors, or you know, outcall escort services, these kinds of things. So that are Indigenous as well. So, you know, I think we don't actually know the full extent. We don't actually know that the actual overrepresentation of Indigenous women and girls in prostitution. But definitely, you know, seeing that overrepresentation, and then seeing what struck me in Auckland was the cost of housing, right? the cost of housing and the lack of affordable housing. And so sometimes women, for example, will they'll live in the brothel that they're working in, right? So if they quit, they're homeless. Right? If they stop, they're homeless. They don't have anywhere to go, right? And it's very expensive there. Cost of living similar to, you know, Canada, a lot of places in Canada. So those kinds of similar struggles, you know, and not enough social supports. And one of the most striking things was the complete lack of exiting services, right? So there's no exiting services in New Zealand. There's no specialized services that will help women leave prostitution. And I expected that. But what I also learned was that other services for women, like rape crisis centers or battered women's shelters, they also think that sex work is work. So they don't understand, they don't have the knowledge, or they misunderstand, you know, how that happens and what it does to women, you know. And so women can't even go there to get, you know, the help that they need if they want to leave. And so meeting women who have tried 3, 4, 5 times to leave, get out of prostitution, and they can't, right? They keep falling back into it because they can't find housing. They can't find a way to sustain themselves. I mean, it's especially true, like, if you're a girl, 18, 19 years old, and you start doing that, what are you going to put on your resume, you know, when you want to leave?
Yeah.
You know, how are you going to, you know, how are you going to manage that, you know? And the world hates women, right? So there are lots of people who judge women for that and assume all of these horrible things that are just lies about women, you know, that have been in prostitution. So women get stuck, and stuck in, you know, in terms of, you know, cost of living, this kind of thing, the impacts of it, also the inability for women to speak against prostitution in New Zealand is huge. That's very, very, very similar to here in Canada. Almost more, I don't want to say more, but it's overwhelming, this idea. They've just kind of accepted prostitution as a thing that happens, and it's generally accepted. It's not really flashy or anything like that. It's just kind of part of the landscape. So it's horrific in almost in a quieter way, which is not better or worse, but just different.
It's back to that quote about how we've just kind of normalized it. We started the conversation and then we kind of stopped the conversation, and all we really managed to do was make it normalized and make everyone aware of the fact that it was really, really normal and okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I guess that's something I don't think about enough, and I haven't thought about enough, is the sort of halfway point of, like, you know, I know that there are services, not enough, not nearly enough, but services for women who get out of prison and are integrating back into the community, or but yeah, we don't, and we always boast about having such a glorious and, you know, robust social services state in Canada, and, you know, but no, there aren't any. I mean, we have, like, you know, and not to criticize, I'm not kind of bringing this aspect up, but we have safe injection sites, but we don't have resources for women who want to exit prostitution. We don't have, right? And I know that they can be intertwined and interlinked, and they provide a service as well. But
I mean, the safe injection sites, I'm like, that's bullshit, man. That's bullshit. Like, I think if you can go in there and stick a needle in your arm in 5 minutes, you should be able to go in and get a bed and detox in 5 minutes too. Like, I'm not saying get rid of all of them, but it's not a choice.
Yeah.
People don't have a choice because you have to wait 2 weeks, a week, 2 weeks to get into detox, and you're expected to stay sober during those 2 weeks while you're getting into detox. Like, not going to happen.
Yeah.
So they really need, I think we really need to have enough detox and recovery beds so that whenever somebody is ready in that moment, that there's room for them. They don't, we can accommodate them. Because yeah, otherwise it's not really a choice. Like, when you wait 5 minutes, when you have to wait 3 weeks. What are you gonna pick, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Right. So if they can allot service, like resources to those services, why not? Yeah. And that infrastructure, it's not a stretch to, stretch it a bit beyond. So as far as like these sort of Commonwealth colonially sort of founded countries are concerned, there's not a lot, there's probably many differences, like just within like the context of geography and culture, but in terms of like the statistics, it's fairly like it's fairly similar. Like there's a lot of similarities there between.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, New Zealand is quite small
Mhm.
compared to Canada, right? The landmass and the culture and the language is fairly similar. So somebody from the North Island can communicate with somebody from the South Island, where across Canada, you have this huge landscape, and then you have tons of different nations with different languages, different cultures, different beliefs, so you can't kind of communicate or weren't able to kind of it's more diverse, I guess you can say.
Yeah. Yeah. And in terms of like, sort of that, I guess, Canadian attitudes across, sort of across the board, whether politically or socially or both, like what would be a step in the right direction for you in regards to this issue in Canada?
The prostitution issue?
Yeah.
Well, definitely more social services for sure. Like, we need housing, but at the same time we really need detox and recovery beds. We like this whole idea of harm reduction, and that we're just going to keep people, it's like we meet people where they're at, and they do that, and then they leave them there. So there's this idea that it's judgmental to talk about maybe getting sober, or that maybe maybe there's a reason why, that there's drugs and alcohol involved here, and maybe your life could be better. Maybe your life could be better, and you deserve a better life, right? I think right now there's this idea that it's just fine. Like, all we want to do is keep people alive, but we don't actually want to improve their lives, and don't think they actually deserve it. And they do. Like, everybody deserves to have happiness and a home and joy in their lives, right? And when you're really addicted, you don't have that in your life. It's not, they're not, you're not having a good time. It's not enjoyable. And I think because especially there's so many Indigenous women and Indigenous men, but I just generally just talk about Indigenous women, who are in prostitution because maybe that's what they saw growing up. That's what was expected of them. Maybe they they needed money. They didn't know what else to do. They went to the city and they were targeted. Like, there's so many ways that happens, right? But it's similar with drug and alcohol addiction. These women are coming with horrific things that have happened to them in their lives, and they're trying their best to cope with it. And so you do have disproportionate levels of drug and alcohol addiction among Indigenous women. So in my mind, it's no surprise that it's like, well, let's just leave them where they are.
Right.
Like, we'll just try and keep them alive, but but that's as far as we're going to go. We're not actually going to try and you know, give them a good life, like how I have a good life. You know, I have a home, and, you know, I'm not dope sick all the time, and I'm not, you know what I mean? So I think it's housing, and it's this shift, I think harm reduction has a place, but it's not the answer, and it's become the answer, like full stop, right? We're not going to do anything beyond this. So I think that needs to shift. Otherwise, we're really not going to get anywhere, because women are suffering, and they're hurt. And it's just, it's going to be so hard. It's so hard. You know, even finding like counseling or like mental health help, like that's really hard to do, you know. So these kinds of things, but I think that the housing, that needs to go hand in hand with expanded detox and recovery options, so that whenever people are ready, it's there, you know, and they can try as many times as they need to try. You're not forcing people, but that it's actually available when you need it, you know. Because I think otherwise, you know, you could have housing and it might not work out, right? Because all of these things are still going on. You still have these problems in your life and all of this kind of stuff. And so making sure that those things go hand in hand, I think, is so important. And then the public education piece. So like actually being able to talk in universities and be critical of prostitution in universities without getting shit on, and I think in classes, like a presentation, like having different perspectives, and being thorough in teaching those different perspectives, so that students know that there's not just one way to think about this issue. There's multiple ways, and it's valid. An abolitionist perspective is a valid perspective, and yeah, so definitely the decriminalizing women in prostitution, full stop. So getting rid of those those sections that do criminalize them. But yeah, I mean, it's hard because these issues are so intertwined, right? And one leads to the other, leads to the other, leads to the other, and so it's like our response can't be siloed either. You know what I mean? Like it has to be kind of holistic and recognize these issues. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. It sounds like you're kind of advocating for a more holistic sort of foundational approach, which, yeah, and it of course is so multifaceted, but we have to start looking at what's causing the issue rather than just continuing to apply sort of an institutionalized and medicalized answer to everything, because that's not the answer to everything. It never has been. It's never going to be a solution. It's always just going to stop the problem for temporarily, right? And not even that usually. Thanks for that. That's yeah, I mean, I can tell how much heart and energy and work you've put into this. And I mean, it speaks volumes throughout your book, literally. Yeah, so I want to shift to you are the founder of a school and you called it Women's Studies Online. And my understanding, I want you to explain, but my understanding is that you kind of started it because women's studies was had been kind of like basically co-opted. When it's called women and gender studies, it kind of just means like women and men studies. So it's not really women's studies anymore, right? So yeah, can you talk a bit about women's studies online and the inception and the concepts and where that started and why you wanted to do it?
Definitely. So essentially, yeah, I started women's studies online because it is, I don't even think, I'd have to check, but it's mostly, it's just gender studies now. So in a lot of cases, they just totally gotten rid of the word women altogether. It's just gender studies. Sometimes it's women and gender studies. And it has become not about women at all. So it's largely, you're talking about queer theory, you're talking about, you know, transgender politics, you're talking about everybody else, meaning men. You know, you're talking about everybody else except women, in what was supposed to be women's studies. And so I noticed that as I was, you know, the lack of exposure students were getting to actual feminist theories and ideas. You know, and so what I would generally do is when I would go to do a guest lecture in a class, I would ask students what they know about radical feminism. And, you know, overwhelmingly, students would say it's bigoted, it's racist, you know, it's hateful, it's outdated. And then I would say, all right, like, so which theorists, like, which theory are you talking about? Which writers? Like, tell me about what parts of radical feminism are these things that you're saying they are. And they didn't know because they hadn't read it. Right, they hadn't been taught it, they weren't exposed to the actual ideas, they were just getting this kind of secondhand information, and were, you know, being told lies about what the theories actually are, what actually happened, you know, what the intent was. So and I know that as part of what I was, it was just, I mean, I think the best part about doing a PhD was how much I got to read, and that was kind of what I did was read. That was incredible to have, like, such a privilege to have the time to do that. And so I looked at the how women's studies came to be in universities in the 60s and 70s, and that it started out as very radical. It started out as a community based. It came from women outside of universities. It was very much linked to the women's liberation movement of the 60s and 70s. And so, you know, they, a lot of times, you know, in where women's studies departments were starting, you know, professors, they would teach outside of their classes, right? They weren't being paid for that, for teaching those classes, but they did it because, you know, they felt it was really important. So, you know, so looking at that and being like, wow, that's cool, you know, and then looking at these amazing books that I got to read, like Theories of Women's Studies. I love that book. It's like, I've used it so much. You know, all of these incredible writers. You know, it's like we don't need to start from zero. And that's a really comforting thing, right? To be like, wow, there's other women that had these thoughts, there's other women that think like me, or they've been through similar things. You know, it's really comforting to know that. And so I was like, well, we really need to try and make sure that women are being exposed to these ideas as they are. Right, you know, and then they can make up their minds about whether or not it makes sense to them. You know, that's what happens. You know, when you learn something, if it makes sense, you're like, yeah, that makes sense. If it doesn't, you're like, no, that's not for me. You know, so so for me, it was really important to make a space where we were able to look at these all this work that women had done, and then build on it. So we can agree with it, disagree with it, criticize it, take it apart, put it back together. You know what I mean? But just recognizing that we already have this foundation, you know, and we can build on that. And I think that it just makes our arguments stronger and our theories stronger. And it is just really comforting to know that, you know, you're not alone in it. You know, other women have been through similar things, and, you know, this is what they did, this is how they dealt with it, you know. So it can be really inspiring, too.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Yeah, it's a really, really cool place. And if, like, everyone should check it out. It is Women's Studies Online, but it's WMST, am I right? And then online.com.
Yes. Yeah, that's it.
WMSTonline.com, Women's Studies Online. Yep.
Because when you would look like in the past, when there actually were women's studies departments, the short form for the courses would usually be WMST.
And I'm going to be honest, like I have actually found that when I'm looking for it, like when I've gone back to like look for it to go to a forum or to read something or whatever, I've actually had kind of a hard time finding it, which is weird. Like I expect it to just like pop up, but I kind of have to like dig a bit. So I don't know if that's just like, you know, the shadow banning, shadow banning.
Patriarchy. Well, good to know. Good to know.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah. It's happened a couple
we'll check
times.
out. We'll check that out.
Yeah.
Weird. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just me. Like maybe it's just my browser or whatever. I don't know. But
It could be something on our end too. We'll check it out with
thank
our
you. Yeah.
person.
Awesome. Again, I want to show the book. It is called Not Sacred, Not Squaws, Indigenous Feminism Redefined. It is I'm about halfway in, and it's just like there's so many important concepts, ideas, theories, and discussions that are shared here that like I feel like all women that affect all women, that are applicable to all women, and are really important discussions to be having right now. Yeah, involving critical perspectives on sort of every issue that affects us today. Yeah, and I guess with that, I'm gonna tell them, or do you want to tell them where they can find you, Sherry?
Like physically or virtually?
Oh, physically. No, I was thinking like online and how like your work and stuff like that.
Okay, good. Like, oh, this is my address. Like, no, you could go to my website. It's cherrysmiley.com. It's probably the best place to start. I'm working on trying to use social media, but I hate it so much. And I took this course and it's like, don't say that you hate social media. And I'm like, I know I shouldn't, but I do. It's just, anyways. So I'm trying to be, so I'm a little bit active on Twitter, not much, but I'm trying to focus a bit more on Instagram because I like pictures and art and stuff like that. It seems like more fun. So I'm on Instagram as well. I have 2 accounts on there. It's the one with the double like the double under,
Yeah,
like where it's like that. You know
yeah,
what I mean?
yeah,
I don't know what that's called.
yeah.
It's my public account. So I'm gonna try and fix that in the next little bit so that it's like proper and you can find me easier
Yeah.
online.
And you're also an artist, and I forgot to mention that, but you're also like a really cool a really awesome artist. Like your stuff is so awesome. It's just so cool and fun, and like yeah, you're a really great artist as
Oh,
well.
thank
And
you.
you have written multiple pieces for the Feminist Current. Um yeah, and Women's Studies Online, again, I want to plug it again because it's so awesome. It has like courses, events that are linked, forums, resources, all types of like feminist resources. And yeah, and you're the founder of that, so that's pretty amazing. It's a really great feminist resource to have, and I'm glad I found it.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Oh, and I do want to say too, that I'm going to be starting to sell prints of my artwork on my website pretty soon. So watch out for that.
Yes. Awesome.
Hopefully it'll be fun.
Yeah, thank you. It was such an honor to have you today, and thanks for sharing your work and yeah, your thoughts and you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks for this. It was a great discussion. Thank
Awesome.
you.
Okay, bye,
All right.
Sherry.
Bye.